June 12, 2024, the day the unipolar moment died. Let me tell you about the moment I realized the American century was ending, not with a bang, but with a press release. It was a quiet Wednesday in Caracas when Nicolas Maduro's government announced that Venezuela had formally requested the United Nations to recognize its claim over the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer swath of jungle and oil-rich territory currently administered by Guyana. The move itself wasn't shocking. Venezuela has been contesting Essequibo for over a century. What made this different was the timing, the brazenness, and the fact that Maduro didn't just make a speech. He sent a letter to the UN with a map. A map that, for the first time in decades, showed Essequibo as Venezuelan territory, not just claimed, but de facto incorporated. And the United States? Silent. Not a single high-level statement from the White House. No carrier strike group rerouted to the Caribbean. No emergency session of the OAS. Just crickets. For those of us who've spent decades watching Washington's reflexive muscle flexing in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the Monroe Doctrine to the 2019 coup attempt in Venezuela, this was the geopolitical equivalent of a parent walking in on their teenager throwing a party and just shrugging. I've been studying great power competition for over 30 years, and I can tell you when a revisionist state makes a bold territorial grab and the hegemon doesn't respond, it's not because the hegemon is choosing not to respond. It's because the hegemon can't. That's the story no one's telling. Not the New York Times, not the State Department, not even the think tanks in Washington that are paid to see these things coming. They'll tell you this is just another flare-up in a long-running border dispute. They'll point to the 2020 referendum where Venezuelans voted to reclaim Essequibo. They'll mention Guyana's newfound oil wealth and ExxonMobil's drilling rights. They might even trot out the old Cold War Maduro as a Russian and Chinese puppet, and this is just another front in the global struggle against democracy. But here's the problem with that: it's not just incomplete. It's deliberately misleading. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the version you've probably heard. On June 12, Venezuela submitted a formal request to the UN, invoking the 1966 Geneva Agreement, a treaty that, in theory, provides a framework for resolving the Essequibo dispute. The Maduro government framed this as a peaceful, legal step, arguing that Guyana's unilateral oil exploration in the disputed waters violates international law. They even included a new map in their submission, one that redraws Venezuela's borders to include Essequibo, complete with a new Venezuelan state called Guayana Essequiba. Guyana, naturally, called this an existential threat. President Irfan Ali took to CNN and the BBC, warning that Venezuela was preparing for an invasion. He pointed to recent military exercises near the border and Maduro's rhetoric about recovering what was stolen. The U.S. State Department, in a carefully worded statement, reaffirmed its support for Guyana's sovereignty and announced joint military exercises with the Guyanese Defense Force. The UK, which has historical ties to Guyana, sent a warship to the region as its show of support. The media narrative fell neatly into place. The Washington Post ran an op-ed titled "Maduro's Land Grab Threatens the Western Hemisphere." The Economist warned of a new flashpoint in Latin America. Even Foreign Policy got in on the act, framing this as part of Venezuela's broader alignment with Russia and China, a proxy conflict in America's backyard. The data seems to support this. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, inflation is north of 200%, and Maduro's approval ratings are abysmal. Russia has been propping up his regime with oil for arms deals, and China has extended billions in loans secured by Venezuela's oil reserves. The U.S. has sanctioned Venezuela's oil industry, frozen its assets, and even indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges. So of course, the thinking goes, Maduro is desperate. He's lashing out. He's trying to distract from his domestic failures by picking a fight with Guyana. But here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. The hidden what's really happening in Essequibo. Let me tell you what the data actually shows and what the talking heads in Washington won't admit. First, Venezuela's move wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. For years, Maduro has been laying the groundwork for this. In 2015, Venezuela's Navy seized an ExxonMobil survey ship operating in disputed waters. In 2018, Maduro held a referendum on Essequibo's status, which passed with 95% support. In 2021, Venezuela's military conducted exercises near the border, and in 2023, Maduro signed a decree creating a new High Commission for the Defense of Guayana Essequibo. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a strategy. Second, the U.S. response has been remarkably restrained. When Ecuador's president was ousted in 2023, the U.S. condemned it within hours. When Nicaragua cracked down on protests in 2018, the U.S. imposed sanctions within days. But here, with Venezuela redrawing its borders and threatening a neighbor, the U.S. response has been a joint military exercise and a strongly worded statement. That's it. No sanctions. No threats of regime change. No carrier strike group. Why? Because the U.S. can't respond the way it used to. Here's the part they're not telling: Venezuela's move is a direct challenge to American unipolarity, and Washington knows it. For decades, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a doctrine of dominance. Any extra-hemispheric power meddling in the Americas was met with swift, often violent, pushback. The Bay of Pigs. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The 1989 invasion of AMA. The 2002 coup attempt in Venezuela. The 2009 Honduras coup. The 2019 coup attempt in Bolivia. The pattern was no one challenges U.S. hegemony in its backyard. But in 2024, that's exactly what's happening, and the U.S. is letting it slide. Why? Because Maduro isn't acting alone. He's got backing. Russia has been deepening its military ties with Venezuela for years. In 2019, Russian nuclear-capable bombers landed in Caracas. In 2020, Russia sent military advisors to help prop up Maduro's regime. In 2023, Venezuela and Russia signed a new defense cooperation agreement, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. And just last month, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Caracas and publicly endorsed Venezuela's claim to Essequibo. China, meanwhile, has been quietly buying up Venezuela's oil. In 2023, China imported over 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, despite U.S. sanctions. Beijing has also extended billions in loans to Caracas, secured by Venezuela's oil reserves. And in 2024, China and Venezuela signed a new strategic partnership agreement, which includes cooperation on territorial integrity. Now, let's connect the dots. Venezuela makes a bold territorial claim. Russia and China immediately back it. The U.S. responds with a joint military exercise. What's really happening here? This isn't just about Essequibo. This is about the death of American unipolarity in Latin America. The broader geopolitical The New Cold War comes to the Americas. Let me put this in perspective. For the past 3 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could maintain global hegemony, that it could be the sole superpower, the indispensable nation, the world's policeman. But that assumption was always built on the idea that no other power could challenge U.S. dominance in its own hemisphere. That foundation is now cracking. What we're seeing in Venezuela is the latest front in a new Cold War, one that's far more complex than the US-Soviet standoff of the 20th century. This time, the challenge isn't just from Russia. It's from China, Iran, and a growing coalition of revisionist states that no longer accept US primacy. And unlike the Soviet Union, these powers aren't just ideological rivals. They're economic rivals. They're military rivals. And most importantly, they're willing to call America's bluff. Let's talk about spheres of influence. The U.S. has spent the last 200 years insisting that it gets to decide what happens in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary. The Rio Treaty. The OAS. The list goes on. But here's the when Russia asserts its sphere of influence in Ukraine, the U.S. calls it imperialism. When China does it in the South China Sea, the U.S. calls it aggression. But when the U.S. does it in Latin America, that's just regional stability. The problem for Washington is that the world is no longer buying that double standard. Russia and China have spent the last decade building alternative institutions, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the New Development Bank, to challenge U.S. financial and military dominance. And now, they're testing the limits of American power in the one region the U.S. has always considered its exclusive domain. Venezuela is the perfect test case. It's a failing state, but it's also a strategic state. It sits on the world's largest oil reserves. It's a gateway to the Caribbean. And it's a historical thorn in America's side. If Russia and China can help Venezuela reclaim Essequibo without triggering a U.S. military response, it sends a message to the rest of the U.S. is no longer willing or able to enforce its red lines. That's why this isn't just about Guyana. It's about Taiwan. It's about Ukraine. It's about the South China Sea. If the U.S. won't defend its interests in its own backyard, why would anyone believe it will defend them halfway across the world? Military, why the Hawks are wrong. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the armchair strategists in Washington are dangerously wrong. The Hawks will tell you this is simple. Just send in the Marines, they'll say. A few airstrikes, a no-fly zone, and Maduro will back down. They'll point to AMA in 1989, Grenada in 1983, even the Dominican Republic in 1965. We've done this before, they'll argue. It's quick. It's easy. It's low risk. But here's the Venezuela in 2024 is not AMA in 1989. First, Venezuela has Russia's backing. That means advanced air defense systems, S-300s, possibly even S-400s. That means electronic warfare capabilities. That means the risk of Russian advisors on the ground. And that means the very real possibility that any U.S. military action in Venezuela could escalate into a direct confrontation with Russia. Second, Venezuela has China's economic support. Beijing has made it clear that it will not tolerate a U.S. invasion of Venezuela. And unlike in 1989, when China was still a developing power, today it has the financial leverage to retaliate. Imagine a scenario where China dumps U.S. Treasury bonds, crashes the dollar, and triggers a global financial crisis, all because the U.S. decided to invade Venezuela over a border dispute. Third, Venezuela has learned from history. The U.S. has a long, ugly history of regime change in Latin America. The Venezuelan military knows this. They've seen what happened in Iraq. They've seen what happened in Libya. They've seen what almost happened in Syria. They're not going to roll over. They're going to fight. And let's not forget the domestic angle. The U.S. public is exhausted from 2 decades of war in the Middle East. The last thing they want is another endless conflict in Latin America. Even if the U.S. could win a war in Venezuela, the political cost would be enormous. The anti-war movement would explode. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party would revolt. And the Republicans would use it as a cudgel against the administration. So no, this isn't quick and easy. This is a quagmire waiting to happen. The domestic political why Biden can't afford to act. Now, let's talk about the real reason the U.S. isn't responding: more domestic politics. Joe Biden is in the fight of his political life. The 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on his presidency, and his approval ratings are underwater. The last thing he needs is another foreign policy crisis, especially one that could alienate key voting blocs. Let's break it. 1. The Latino vote. Florida is a must-win state for Biden, and the Latino vote there is critical. But Florida's Venezuelan exile community is vehemently anti-Maduro. They want regime change. They want military action. If Biden doesn't respond forcefully to Venezuela's move, he risks losing their support. But if he does respond forcefully, he risks alienating the broader Latino community, which is overwhelmingly opposed to another U.S. war in Latin America. 2. The progressive base. The left wing of the Democratic Party has been pushing for a more restrained foreign policy. They're tired of endless wars. They're tired of regime change. They're tired of the U.S. acting like the world's policeman. If Biden orders military action in Venezuela, he'll face a rebellion within his own party. 3. The Trump factor. Donald Trump is already framing Venezuela escalates without crossing the threshold of war. Maduro sends civilian settlers into Essequibo, backed by military escorts. He declares the region as special economic zone and starts issuing Venezuelan passports to Guyanese citizens. Guyana protests, but without U.S. military support, it can't do much. The U.S. imposes symbolic sanctions, but Russia and China step in to prop up Venezuela's economy. Over time, Essequibo becomes a de facto part of Venezuela, even if the international community doesn't recognize it. Why this is the salami slicing strategy, taking small, incremental steps that don't justify a full-scale U.S. response. It's what Russia did in Crimea. It's what China is doing in the South China Sea. And it's exactly what Venezuela is doing now. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. Venezuela invades Essequibo. Not a full-scale war, but a limited military operation, perhaps seizing a key oil installation or a border town. Guyana, outgunned and outmatched, calls for U.S. military support. The U.S. faces a Hobson's choice: intervene and risk a direct conflict with Russia, or stand by and watch Venezuela take territory by force. If the U.S. doesn't intervene, it sends a message to the American security guarantees are worthless. Taiwan, Ukraine, the Baltics, they'll all take note. If the U.S. does intervene, it risks a global escalation. Russia could retaliate in Ukraine. China could move on Taiwan. Iran could escalate in the Middle East. And all of this would happen in the middle of a U.S. election year. Why Maduro is desperate. His regime is on the brink. A military victory would be a lifeline, a way to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from his collapsing economy. And if he's backed into a corner, he might just take that gamble. The question isn't whether he can pull it off. Venezuela's military is a shadow of its former self, but it's still more than capable of overwhelming Guyana's tiny defense force. The question is whether he dares, and whether the U.S. is willing to call his bluff. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the unraveling of the entire U.S.-led security architecture in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old declaration that the Western Hemisphere is off-limits to foreign powers, has been on life support for decades. But what's happening now is the final nail in the coffin. Russia and China aren't just spectators here, they're active enablers, and they're doing it right under Washington's nose. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's military isn't operating in a vacuum. Since 2005, Russia has sold Caracas over $11 billion in arms, including Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. China, meanwhile, has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, keeping the regime afloat even as U.S. sanctions cripple its economy. And then there's Iran, which has been quietly supplying drones and military advisors to Venezuela for years. In 2020, the U.S. even intercepted a shipment of Iranian missiles bound for Caracas. This isn't just a rogue state acting alone, it's a proxy war by other means. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no good options here. If it does nothing, it emboldens not just Maduro, but every revisionist power watching from the sidelines. If it intervenes, it risks a direct confrontation with Russia, which has already warned that any U.S. military action in Venezuela would be met with serious consequences. And let's not forget that Russia has a military presence in Venezuela. Since 2019, Russian troops have been stationed at an airbase outside Caracas, and Russian warships have made port calls in Venezuelan waters. This isn't just posturing. It's a tripwire. The Pentagon knows this. That's why, despite all the tough talk from the White House, the U.S. response has been so tepid. The recent military exercises with Guyana were a show of support, but they were also a signal to "we see you, but we're not going to war over this." And that's the problem. Because Maduro knows the U.S. won't go to war over Essequibo. He's betting on it. So what happens next? If I had to put money on it, I'd say we're heading toward scenario 2, the slow, creeping annexation of Essequibo. Maduro will keep pushing the boundaries, testing how far he can go before the U.S. pushes back. He'll send in civilian settlers, declare the region a Venezuelan province, and dare Guyana to do something about it. And Guyana, for all its oil wealth, is a country of less than 1 million people with an army of just 3,000 soldiers. It's not going to fight a war it can't win. But here's where it gets really dangerous. Because if Maduro succeeds in taking Essequibo without a fight, it won't just be a victory for Venezuela. It'll be a victory for every authoritarian regime that's been waiting for the US to blink. China will see it as proof that the US won't defend its allies in the global south. Russia will see it as an opportunity to exert its influence in Latin America. And Iran? Well, Iran will see it as an invitation to double down on its own proxy wars in the region. The real question is whether the US has the stomach for this fight. Because make no mistake, this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the future of US power in the Western Hemisphere. And right now, that future is looking a lot less certain than it did a decade ago. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The question is whether anyone in Washington has noticed. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy failure, it's a domestic political time bomb for the Biden administration. And the White House knows it. You don't need to be a Beltway insider to see the cracks forming. Just look at the polling. A December 2023 Harvard Capps/Harris survey found that 62% of Americans believe the US is losing influence globally, and 58% think the administration isn't doing enough to counter adversaries like Russia and China. Those numbers aren't just bad, they're catastrophic for a president already struggling with approval ratings in the low 40s. And Maduro? He's not just testing Guyana. He's testing Biden's resolve in an election year. Here's the uncomfortable: the administration's response to Venezuela's aggression has been a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, and that's not an accident. The White House is caught between two impossible choices. On one hand, they can't afford to look weak, not when Republicans are already framing Biden as a feckless leader who let Putin walk all over Ukraine and now can't stop a third-rate dictator from stealing a chunk of South America. On the other hand, they can't escalate without risking a wider conflict in a region where the US has spent decades trying to avoid direct military entanglements. So what do? They issue strongly worded statements, impose targeted sanctions that won't change Maduro's calculus, and hope the problem goes away before November. Let me explain why this matters beyond the election. The US has spent the last 30 years outsourcing its Latin America policy to a mix of economic coercion, covert operations, and occasional military interventions. But that playbook is obsolete. The sanctions regime against Venezuela has been in place since 2017, and what's it accomplished? Maduro is still in power. Venezuela's oil exports to China and India have surged despite US restrictions, and now he's making a play for territory that could give him control over one of the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned over 150 Venezuelan officials and entities, and yet here we are. Sanctions don't work when your adversaries have alternative markets and patrons willing to prop them up. And that brings me to the real domestic political: the collapse of bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. For decades, Democrats and Republicans could at least agree on the basics: contain Russia, counter China, support democratic allies. But that consensus is gone. The GOP is now a party where isolationist factions, led by figures like J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson, openly question the value of U.S. alliances, while the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is increasingly skeptical of military interventions and economic coercion. The result? A foreign policy that's paralyzed by internal divisions. When Maduro held his sham referendum on Essequibo in December 2023, the U.S. response was a patchwork of contradictory signals. The State Department condemned the move, the Pentagon sent a warship to Guyana as a show of force, and then the White House quietly backtracked, emphasizing diplomacy over confrontation. That's not strategy, that's policy whiplash. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. If Maduro continues his slow-motion annexation of Essequibo, the U.S. has three broad options, none of them good. The first is to double down on sanctions, but as we've seen, that's unlikely to change Maduro's behavior. The second is to provide military aid to Guyana, but that risks escalating the conflict without guaranteeing a favorable outcome. Guyana's defense budget is a rounding error in global terms, just $120 million in 2023, and its military is a fraction the size of Venezuela's. The third option is the most: do nothing and hope the problem resolves itself. That's the path of least resistance, but it's also the path that emboldens every revisionist power watching this play out. Here's where the historical parallels get eerie. In 1938, when Hitler annexed the Sudetenland, the Western democracies responded with appeasement, hoping that giving him what he wanted would satisfy his ambitions. We know how that turned out. Now, I'm not saying Maduro is Hitler, but the dynamic is the same. When authoritarians see that aggression pays, they don't stop at the first bite. They take the whole meal. And if the US allows Venezuela to seize Essequibo without meaningful consequences, what's to stop Nicaragua from making a play for Costa Rica's northern territories? Or Bolivia from reviving its old claims to Chile's coastline? The Western Hemisphere could descend into a free-for-all, with the US too distracted by its own domestic divisions to do anything about it. The other wild card here is the oil factor. Essequibo isn't just a piece of land, it's a potential bonanza. ExxonMobil's 2015 discovery of massive offshore oil reserves in the region transformed Guyana from a sleepy backwater into one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Guyana's GDP grew by 62% in 2022 alone, and the IMF projects it will EXD by another 38% in 2024. That kind of wealth changes the geopolitical calculus. If Maduro takes Essequibo, he doesn't just gain territory, he gains control over a resource that could make Venezuela relevant again. And that's a nightmare scenario for the US, which has spent the last decade trying to reduce its dependence on Venezuelan oil while keeping a lid on the country's destabilizing influence. So where does this leave us? If I had to make a prediction, I'd say we're heading toward a prolonged standoff where Maduro continues to push the boundaries, the US responds with half measures, and Guyana is left to fend for itself. The Biden administration will try to thread the needle strong enough to avoid looking weak, but not so strong that it triggers a crisis. And Maduro? He'll keep probing, because he knows that in an election year, the last thing Biden wants is another foreign policy headache. The real losers here are the people of Guyana, who are watching their country's future being decided by forces beyond their control. But here's the thing about it's never just about the immediate crisis. It's about the signals you send to the rest of the world. And right now, the signal the US is sending is that it's too divided, too distracted, and too risk-averse to defend its interests in its own backyard. That's a message that won't just embolden Maduro. It'll embolden every authoritarian leader who's been waiting for the moment when America's power finally breaks. And that, more than anything, is why this matters. Because once that perception takes hold, it's almost impossible to reverse. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana, it's about the unraveling of a domestic political consensus in the United States that has, for decades, underpinned its ability to project power abroad. The Biden administration's response to Maduro's gambit isn't just weak, it's symptomatic of a deeper paralysis, one that's been building since at least the Obama years but has accelerated under the weight of polarization, institutional decay, and a foreign policy establishment that's lost its compass. Let me explain why this matters. The US has always relied on a bipartisan consensus around certain core that America's global leadership is non-negotiable, that adversaries must be deterred before they act, and that the Western Hemisphere is a zone of US primacy where challenges are met with swift, decisive action. That consensus is now in tatters. The Republican Party, once the standard-bearer of muscular interventionism, is now a coalition of isolationists, populists, and transactional realists who see foreign policy as a distraction from domestic grievances. The Democrats, meanwhile, are caught between a progressive base that wants to dismantle the national security state and a centrist establishment that still clings to the old playbook even as the playbook no longer works. You can see this dysfunction in the numbers. A 2023 Chicago Council on Global Affairs survey found that only 45% of Americans believe the U.S. should take an active role in world affairs, down from 66% in 2002. More telling, support for defending allies has collapsed. Just 38% of Republicans and 56% of Democrats say the U.S. should use military force to defend a NATO ally under attack, a staggering decline from the post-9/11 era. And when it comes to Latin America? Forget it. The same survey found that only 22% of Americans prioritize strengthening ties with the region, despite its critical importance to U.S. security and economic interests. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is no longer willing or able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, even in its modern, watered-down form. and Maduro knows it. He's not just testing Guyana's borders, he's testing the limits of American patience, and he's doing it at a moment when the U.S. political system is too fractured to respond coherently. The Biden administration's initial reaction, a few sternly worded statements, a show of naval force in the Caribbean, and a promise to review sanctions, was exactly what Maduro expected. It was performative, not punitive. And it sent a clear the U.S. is more interested in managing the crisis than resolving it. But this isn't just about Biden. The rot goes deeper. Take Congress, which has become a graveyard for Latin America policy. The last time the Senate confirmed an Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs was in 2018. Since then, the position has been filled by acting officials or left vacant for months at a time. The House Foreign Affairs Committee, once a bastion of bipartisan consensus on the region, is now a partisan battleground where even routine matters like funding for democracy promotion in Venezuela get bogged down in culture war fights over immigration and socialism. And don't even get me started on the State Department, which has hemorrhaged expertise on Latin America over the past decade. The Office of the Special Envoy for Venezuela, created in 2019 to coordinate policy toward Maduro, has seen its staff slashed by nearly 40% since 2021. That's not a policy failure, that's institutional neglect. Now, you might, why does this matter for Essequibo? Because Maduro's move isn't just about territory or oil. It's about exploiting a moment of American weakness to rewrite the rules of the game in the hemisphere. And he's not alone. Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega has already expelled the OAS and is flirting with deeper ties to Russia and Iran. Cuba, despite its economic collapse, remains a thorn in Washington's side, hosting Russian intelligence assets and Chinese surveillance facilities. Even Mexico, a nominal U.S. ally, has spent the past 6 years playing a delicate balancing act, cooperating on migration while deepening ties with Beijing and refusing to condemn Maduro's authoritarianism. What we're seeing isn't just a series of isolated challenges, it's the emergence of a post-American order in Latin America, one where U.S. influence is conditional, not dominant. The question: what happens next? If I had to game out the scenarios, I'd say we're looking at 3 possible paths, none of them good. The first is the most: a prolonged stalemate, where Maduro keeps the pressure on Guyana without actually invading. He'll use the threat of force to extract concessions, maybe a share of the oil revenues, maybe a lifting of U.S. sanctions, maybe just the recognition that Venezuela has a say in Essequibo's future. The U.S. will respond with a mix of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and symbolic military deployments, but it won't risk a direct confrontation. Guyana, meanwhile, will be left to fend for itself, relying on its newfound oil wealth to buy security guarantees from Brazil, the UK, and maybe even India. This is the muddle-through scenario, where no one wins but no one loses catastrophically either. It's also the scenario where U.S. credibility erodes further, because it reinforces the idea that Washington is a paper tiger in its own backyard. The second scenario is more: Maduro miscalculates. Maybe he thinks the U.S. is too distracted by Ukraine and the Middle East to respond. Maybe he believes his own propaganda about Venezuela's military strength. Or maybe he just gets greedy and decides to take a bite out of Essequibo, figuring that the U.S. will blink first. If that happens, the Biden administration will face an impossible choice. Does it risk a direct confrontation with Venezuela, which could spiral into a broader regional crisis? Or does it stand by and watch a U.S. ally get carved up, sending a message to every other adversary that America's red lines are negotiable? Either way, the damage to U.S. credibility would be severe. And if Maduro succeeds in seizing even a sliver of Essequibo, it would trigger a gold rush of territorial claims across Latin America, from Belize to Suriname to the Falklands. That's not just a crisis, that's a geopolitical earthquake. The third scenario is the most unlikely but also the most the U.S. finally wakes up. Imagine if the Biden administration, instead of dithering, launched a full-court press to isolate Maduro. Not just sanctions, but a coordinated effort with the EU, Canada, and Latin American allies to cut off Venezuela's access to global financial markets. Not just naval exercises, but a clear, public commitment to defend Guyana's territorial integrity, backed by a deployment of U.S. forces to the region. And not just empty rhetoric, but a real push to revive democracy in Venezuela through support for the opposition, targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle, and a diplomatic offensive to delegitimize his regime. This would require political will, bipartisan cooperation, and a willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term gain. In other words, it would require the US to act like a superpower again. But here's the domestic political conditions for that kind of response simply don't exist. The Republican Party is too divided to support a Democratic president on foreign policy, especially in an election year. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party would scream about imperialism and demand a focus on domestic issues. And the American public? They're too exhausted by 2 decades of war to care about a territorial dispute in a country most of them couldn't find on a map. That's the real tragedy here. The US has the tools to deter Maduro, but it lacks the political will to use them. And in geopolitics, will is everything. So where does this leave us? In a world where the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, but also not yet willing to cede that role entirely, it leaves us in a gray zone, where adversaries like Maduro can push the boundaries without fear of serious consequences, and allies like Guyana are left to wonder if Washington will have their back when it matters. And it leaves us with a question that should keep policymakers up: but if the US can't defend its interests in its own backyard, what does that say about its ability to do so anywhere else? The answer, I'm afraid, is that we're entering an era where American power is not just declining, but becoming increasingly unreliable. And that's a problem not just for Guyana or Venezuela, but for the entire international order. Because when the world's most powerful country stops acting like one, the consequences aren't just local, they're global. And we're only beginning to see what that looks like.